Hello everyone, wish you a wonderful day. Today we're going to explore the moment Diep and Jame are forced to face Mr. Phat's cold ultimatum, an offer to trade peace for silence. If you enjoy it, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. That afternoon didn't feel like an afternoon. It felt like a warning. Wearing daylight, Jame received the message while he was standing by the window, watching the street as if the air itself could carry trouble. The phone vibrated once, short, confident, and final. Unknown number, one line only. Come alone, 4:30. You know where. Jame didn't need the name to recognize the voice behind it. Mr. Phat never had to introduce himself. He always arrived like a shadow that believed it owned the room. Diep noticed the change in Jame's face immediately. His shoulders tightened. His eyes went somewhere far away, to a place where he had learned to swallow fear without making a sound. "What is it?" Diep asked. Jame hesitated. In that pause lived 1,000 things he didn't want to bring into their home. Pressure, old control, old wounds. He turned the phone slightly so she could read the message. Diep's breath caught. "Mr. Phat." Jame nodded once. Diep's first instinct was simple and brave. "I'm going with you." Jame shook his head gently but firmly. "No." "Jame," Diep stepped closer, voice lower. "I'm tired of being protected like a secret. If he wants to talk, he can talk to both of us." Jame's jaw tightened. "That's exactly why you can't come," he said quietly. "He doesn't talk. He cuts." Diep stared at him. "So, you go alone and let him cut you?" Jame's eyes softened for a moment. "I'll be careful." Diep didn't look convinced. She folded her arms as if holding herself together. "If this is about me, I deserve to hear it." Jame took a breath, slow. "It's about control," he said. "And he thinks you're the handle." Diep's lips parted, but no words came out. She hated how accurate that sounded. Jame reached for her hands and held them. His grip was warm, steady, like he was trying to transfer calm into her skin. "I'm not going there to negotiate love," he said. "I'm going there to end a pattern." Diep swallowed hard. "Then promise me something." "What?" Jame asked. Diep's voice trembled. "Promise you won't hide things from me anymore? Not to protect me? Not to handle it?" Jame's eyes flickered. There it was. Her fear wasn't only Mr. Phat. It was the possibility that the man she trusted might start keeping secrets in the name of safety. Jame nodded slowly. "I promise I'll tell you what happens." Diep held his gaze. "All of it?" "All of it," James said. But the way he said it felt like a vow he knew would hurt. When Jame left, Diep stood at the doorway and watched him walk away. She didn't wave. She couldn't. She just stood there, still, the way people stand when they are trying not to fall apart. The place Mr. Phat chose was not loud. It didn't need to be. A quiet, private lounge, the kind of room built for decisions that don't want witnesses. Mr. Phat was already seated when Jame arrived, a cup of tea untouched in front of him. He looked calm in the way only powerful men can afford to look calm, like time belonged to him. He didn't stand. He didn't greet. He only said, "Sit." Jame sat, not because he obeyed, but because he refused to show weakness. Mr. Phat studied him for a long moment, eyes cold and measuring. "You're thinner," he said, as if discussing the weather. Jame didn't answer. Mr. Phat's mouth curved into something that wasn't a smile. "Still stubborn?" he murmured. "Just like your mother used to complain." Jame's fingers tightened around the armrest. Mr. Phat always used other people's names like tools. "Say what you want," Jame said. "I don't have time." Mr. Phat leaned back. "You came," he replied. "So you do have time." Silence sat between them like a third person. Then Mr. Phat placed a folder on the table. Neat, thick, prepared. "This is not a conversation," Mr. Phat said. "This is an offer." James' eyes stayed on the folder. "I'm not buying anything from you." Mr. Phat tapped the folder once. "You already did," he said. "For years." James' voice lowered. "What do you want, Mr. Phat?" Mr. Phat finally looked directly into his eyes. "Peace," he said. "In this family." James let out a humorless breath. "You don't know what peace is." Mr. Phat didn't flinch. "Peace is simple," he said. "It's silence. It's obedience. It's not bringing unstable elements into the house." James' throat tightened. "Diep is not an element." Mr. Phat raised one eyebrow. "To you," he said, "she is a feeling. To me, she is risk." James leaned forward slightly. If you're here to insult her, we're done." Mr. Phat's voice turned colder. "You misunderstand," he said. "I'm not insulting her. I'm describing the consequences of keeping her close." James' eyes narrowed. "Consequences you create?" Mr. Phat didn't deny it. That was the frightening part. He opened the folder and slid out a single sheet of paper. On it were a few lines, clean, typed, and cruelly calm. "Listen carefully," Mr. Phat said. "I will give you a choice that protects her." James' chest rose. "I don't need your protection." Mr. Phat's gaze didn't move. "Yes, you do," he said, "because you cannot protect her from everything." James stared at him. Mr. Phat continued, slow, precise. "You will stop pushing against me. You will stop digging. Stop trying to expose anything. Stop stirring old dust. You will live quietly, work quietly, love quietly." James' voice sharpened. "Love quietly? You mean hide her?" Mr. Phat nodded once. "You call it hiding. I call it preserving." James' hands clenched. "And, if I don't?" Mr. Phat's eyes turned into stone. "If you choose Diep," Mr. Phat said plainly, "you lose something important." James didn't blink. "What?" Mr. Phat held the silence long enough to make it feel like pressure on the lungs. "Then," he said, "your future." James' lips pressed together. "You mean money?" Mr. Phat corrected him. "I mean access. I mean protection. I mean the foundation you stand on." James' voice went low. "You think my life is a foundation you built?" Mr. Phat leaned in slightly. "I know it is," he said, "and I can remove a brick anytime I want." James' eyes burned. "So this is blackmail?" Mr. Phat's face remained calm. "This is parenting," he answered. "A father, cleaning up a mess." James laughed once, bitter. "You don't want to clean up. You want to control." Mr. Phat's gaze hardened. "Control is what keeps families alive," he said. "Your soft heart will ruin you." James stood. The chair scraped softly against the floor, a small sound that felt like rebellion. "I won't trade peace for silence," James said. "That's not peace. That's prison." Mr. Phat looked up at him. "Sit down," he said. James didn't. Mr. Phat exhaled, as if disappointed. "I didn't bring you here to argue," he said. "I brought you here to warn you." James' voice was steady. "Warn me about what? More threats?" Mr. Phat's eyes flicked toward the door. "Diep didn't come," he said. "Good. She doesn't need to see what you're about to see." James froze. "What are you talking about?" Mr. Phat pulled out his phone and pressed play on a short audio clip. At first, there was only static. Then a voice. James' own voice. Diep's breath, faint in the background. A sentence spoken in a tired night. The kind of sentence people say when they think no one is recording. "Don't tell Diep yet. If she knows, she'll panic." James' face drained. Mr. Phat stopped the audio and placed the phone down gently, like a judge placing evidence. It was the sound of trust cracking. Mr. Phat spoke softly, almost kindly, which made it worse. "You see?" he said as, "You hide things too. You and I are not so different." James' throat tightened. "That recording, where did you get that?" Mr. Phat shrugged slightly. "Does it matter?" he asked. "The words are yours." James' hands trembled once, barely. "It was about you," he admitted. "I didn't want her to be scared." Mr. Phat's eyes narrowed. "And yet you lied by omission," he said. "You call it love. I call it weakness." James leaned forward, voice sharp. "You're doing this to poison her against me." Mr. Phat didn't deny it. He only said, "I'm showing you how easy it is to break a fragile thing." James' jaw flexed. "My relationship with Diep is not fragile." Mr. Phat tilted his head. "Then why do you need secrets?" he asked. James' chest rose and fell. He realized the trap. If he stayed quiet, Diep would doubt him. If he spoke too soon, she would panic. Mr. Phat had built the ultimatum to make either choice painful. Mr. Phat slid the folder closer again. "Sign," he said. "Stop fighting. Keep your peace. Keep your woman. Keep your little life." James stared at the paper. Then he pushed it back. "No," he said. One word. Final. Mr. Phat's eyes hardened. "Then you choose war," he replied. James stood straighter. "No," he corrected. "I choose honesty." Mr. Phat's mouth tightened. "Honesty is expensive," he said. You don't have enough." James' voice lowered. "We'll see." When James left the lounge, the sky looked the same, but the world felt different. His phone buzzed again. A second message from the same number. "Tell her, or I will." James' steps slowed. His heart felt heavy. Not from fear for himself, but fear for what this would do to Diep. Back at home, Diep was waiting by the window again. She tried to look calm, but the way she held her hands told the truth. Jame walked in and closed the door behind him. Diep didn't ask how it went. She asked something sharper. "Did he threaten me?" she said. Jame looked at her, then nodded slowly. "He threatened everything." Diep's eyes didn't leave his face. "What did he show you?" Jame swallowed. "He showed me proof that he has been listening," he said. "And he tried to make me sign an agreement, silence in exchange for peace." Diep's lips parted. "And you refused?" "Yes," James said. Diep's shoulders loosened for half a second until she asked very softly, "Jame, is there anything you haven't told me?" The room went quiet. James stepped closer. "Diep, listen." Diep held up a hand, not angry, just trembling. "Please," she whispered. "Just answer." James' eyes shone with pain. "There are things I held back," he admitted. "Not to betray you, to protect you." Diep's voice cracked. "That's still hiding." James nodded slow. "I know." Diep looked down as if the floor might hold her steadier than her own thoughts. Then she whispered the sentence that opened the ending like a door. "So, what else have you hidden from me, Jame?" Jame reached for her hands again. She didn't pull away. But she didn't hold on tightly either. Outside, the night settled quietly. The kind of quiet that comes right before the next storm.
Tập này đã đẩy Diệp và Jame vào tình huống căng thẳng nhất khi Mr Phat gọi Jame gặp riêng vào bữa tối hậu thư, đổi bình yên lấy im lặng. Ông yêu cầu Jame ngừng chống đối, ngừng điều tra và phải yêu trong bóng tối để đổi lấy sự yên ổn. Cao trào bùng nổ khi Mr Phat lạnh lùng tuyên bố: "Nếu con chọn Diệp, con sẽ mất đi một thứ rất quan trọng." Jame phản kháng, từ chối ký bất kỳ thỏa thuận nào. Nhưng Mr Phat tung ra một bằng chứng ghi âm giọng Jame từng nói "đừng nói cho Diệp biết", khiến Jame hiểu rằng niềm tin của Diệp có thể bị bẻ gãy. Về nhà, Diệp nhìn thẳng vào Jame và bắt đầu nghi ngờ: "Anh còn giấu em chuyện gì nữa không?" kết thúc đầy bất an.